Diamond Head, Lightning to the Nations. Starting off with the one album that slightly feels like a 70s pick, we have this classic heavy metal juggernaut. In addition to the new wave of British heavy metal sound though, this album is also speed metal, and even has hints of thrash metal, glam metal, and even prog metal, none of which were even existing genres yet in 1980. Their most well-known track is Am I Evil, which was famously covered by Metallica, and is possibly one of the best heavy metal songs of all time. To use a bad pun, this album really captured lightning in a bottle. It really caught the shock, another bad pun, of all the various elements of 70s metal and mashed it together into a single album. Everything from here onwards, in the 80s, seems like it stems from this record specifically. The vibrant guitar and bass, and the flamboyant vocals make this an enjoyable listen, and the influence of this record, for a band that isn't exactly a household name, is astonishing. Is it a great album? Yes, it is. Yes, I am. Metallica, Ride the Lightning. Honestly, there could be a placeholder slot for any of Metallica's contributions in the 80s. Kill 'Em All is considered by many to be the first thrash metal album, so that alone could justify it being on this list. However, I think that Kill 'Em All is the weakest of their albums from the 80s. I know this will be a controversial take, but it mostly sounds like a Diamond Head cover band with a bit of Motorhead mixed in. Not that it's a bad album by any means, but compared to Master of Puppets or Injustice for All, it doesn't really compare. Listen to Kill 'Em All back to back with Lightning to the Nations, and you'll see what I mean. It is very similar. There are a surprising amount of similarities. For me at least, Metallica didn't truly become Metallica until Ride the Lightning.
I think they really came into their own, commercially and artistically.
Obviously, they still wore their influence on their sleeve, even being cheeky about it by working lightning into the title, which is fitting because they are riding the lightning. They are riding the shockwaves caused by 70s metal and Diamond Head. The opener, Fight Fire with Fire, is a quintessential thrash metal classic. However, I would argue this album is also one of the early prog metal albums. For example, I think For Whom the Bell Tolls is a bit too slow and experimental to merely be considered thrash metal. There's also Metallica's first ballad track, Fade to Black, which I do believe to be the best of their ballads. And Escape is a great anthem, which demonstrates the individualistic, freedom-fighting spirit found in Metallica from here on out. I said in the previous list that if 70s is shock, then 80s is denial. And to clarify, denial isn't just covering your eyes and ears and pretending problems don't exist. Denial is also the act of denying, like denying authority, for example. I already stated that metal had started going in a more rebellious punk direction with Motorhead, and I think that Metallica is the pinnacle of this libertarian spirit that metal had in the 80s. The following two albums, Master Puppets and Injustice for All, only doubled down on this further, and also solidified their progressive thrash metal sound. Death Angel, the ultra-violence. Now, by contrast, if you want to hear an album that is nothing but pure, unadulterated thrash metal, this album is it. The first track is even called Thrashers, and it speaks for itself. This album is especially impressive considering that they were teenagers. The drummer was only 14, and the singer was only 17 when they recorded the album. The singing is also really unique, and features what I jokingly refer to as puberty screams. I don't know if it was just because he was so young, or because he wasn't doing the proper technique, but the end result is a vocal style that I've not yet heard in anything else, and for that, I appreciate it. and the instrumentation just rips in the best way possible. The guitars crunch, the drums snap, and the bass tingles, I guess. My favorite track is Mistress of Pain.
Mistress of Pain, leading to my nation.
Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time.
Not wasting time, always searching for those wasted years.
Again, much like Metallica, you could probably pick any album that Iron Maiden released in the 80s and be set. But I'm going with this one. Wasted Years is my personal favorite Maiden tune.
Ain't it funny how it is? You never miss it till it's gone away.
The genre of Iron Maiden is highly contested, some stating they are just a new wave of British heavy metal band like Judas Priest, and others say that they are power metal. I also threw my hat in the ring when I controversially said they are prog metal. After mulling it over, I think they have elements of all three. All the songs on this record are catchy, but there is lots of nuance to the instrumentation to keep it from getting repetitive. Many metalheads debate whether Maiden or Priest is better. The answer is Maiden. Nah, it's totally fine if you prefer Priest, though personally, I enjoy how all of Maiden's lyrics tell a story. I know that Iron Maiden is mainstream to a point that teenagers are wearing Maiden shirts without even knowing it's a band, but they are ubiquitous for a reason. Rat, Out of the Cellar. I felt that it would be a bit disingenuous if I didn't include at least one glam metal release. Now, if I made a tier list of metal genres, glam metal would be near the bottom. But this album is actually pretty cool. It captures that raunchy LA strip sound without being quite as cringe and degenerate as other bands such as Poison or Motley Crue. But I can get off my high horse for a moment. Not everything has to be edgy or super meaningful. This is a fun record. Is it vapid, superficial, and materialistic?
She wants money, wants money. She wants money.
Absolutely, but not to an egregious degree. So if you're going to listen to glam metal, this is the cream of the crop. Tracks like Round and Round
I knew right from the beginning you would end up winning.
and Back for More are anthems of the style.
You're back for more.
Napalm Death, Scum. Now, from the mainstream to the extreme, we have the original Grindcore album, which I think is still to this day one of the better albums of the genre. Which maybe isn't saying a lot, but still. If you are more of a layman and wondering what grindcore is and how it differs from death metal, the simplest explanation is that grindcore is to death metal what punk rock is to rock and roll. It's a noisy, messier version that is often politically charged. As I mentioned with the rebellious nature of 80s music, it is no longer sufficient to mildly mock and shock like it was in the 70s. But now, music must actively provoke and offend, to deny authority. This is why we see the birth of extreme forms of metal in the 80s, and in 1987, there wasn't much more extreme than this. If the cover art isn't provocative enough against the world's governments and corporations, then the barking vocals, chaotic drumming, amplifier feedback, and hilariously short song lengths were certainly enough to catch people's attention back then. While most of the songs are too short to even register that they occurred, let alone be enjoyable, some of them, such as the title track, are a great jam. Candlemass, Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus. The original epic doom metal album. This is one rare example where a band actually named their own subgenre. Again, for the layman, the simple explanation for epic doom metal would be that it takes the doom metal sound that Black Sabbath is famous for and combines it with power metal. It somehow has an even gloomier tone. If you thought Sabbath was for doomers, Candlemass is the true doomer music.
Please let me die in solitude.
It has a more epic vibe, as if you are a downtrodden adventurer, ye old, pre-modern doomer, This is the type of metal that I would expect to hear in a spooky castle or a dingy medieval dungeon. This is the music for when you and the dragon kill each other at the same time. A triumphant defeat. What a record. Solitude is their most famous tune, but the whole thing is a banger, start to finish, with its menacing, lingering sound. Bathory, Blood, Fire, Death. This is one of the first real black metal albums, and man is it good. Coming out in 1988, it still holds up against modern releases. It just sounds so evil. The blustering buzzsaw guitars and howling shrieks are at their absolute peak here. This album is also considered to be the first Viking metal album. And no, that's not some gimmicky thing like pirate metal. It's essentially a mix of black metal and folk metal. The track, A Fine Day to Die, is an anthemic metal masterpiece, starting off with a solemn hymn, which bursts into a metal fury of blackened proportions. With lyrics about proudly dying on the battlefield in the ultimate act of defiance. Easily one of the best metal songs ever made. A great piece of metal history that holds up brilliantly. Queensryche, Operation Mindcrime. This one is pretty cool. It's a concept album that's very 1984-esque. It's literally 1984. In keeping with the rebellious, authority-denying themes in much of 80s metal, this takes it to another level, portraying a totalitarian dystopia of mind control, propaganda, religious corruption, greed, degeneracy, addiction, and political violence. Clearly, pure science fiction. Obviously, it's meant to be listened to in full, but there are quite a few tracks that make great standalone singles. This album combines prog metal and heavy metal, and is considered to be one of the first, and of course hugely influential, progressive metal records, a classic that should not be overlooked. Faith No More, The Real Thing. This is a more lighthearted album compared to some of the others on the list. By the late 80s, people were becoming fatigued with the excess of glam metal, but most other metal wasn't exactly radio-friendly. Then came along funk metal. Funk metal may be commonly thought of as an odd curiosity of the 90s, but there were a few bands in the 80s already playing this emerging style. Epic was a big hit, and is also considered by some to be one of the first rap metal songs as well. This album is on the tamer side of metal for sure, but it surprisingly has a few really good melodic parts. And also some thrashy moments. It's a fun record, and it even has a funk metal cover of War Pigs by Black Sabbath, which is a bop. Annihilator, Alice in Hell. Technical thrash metal is a style that is a little hard to get into, but Annihilator seems to be able to make it catchy and fun. It's difficult to not sing along to the chorus of the title track.
What else can you do?
Human Insecticide is also a thrash classic. Don't have a ton to say about this one. The intro song, Crystal Ann, is beautiful. And this is a must for any thrashers out there.
Alice in Hell.
Mayhem, Death Crush. Holy, this is something else. Mayhem are mostly known for their disturbing history, as well as pioneering true black metal in the early 90s. This EP, however, is quite distinct from their later work. I can say quite confidently that this was the heaviest thing released in the 80s. It is also hard to describe its sound. It's not just black metal, but also grindcore, and even epic doom metal. It's as if they put Bathory, Napalm Death, and Candlemass in a blender, and this was the result. To this day, nothing sounds quite as raw and evil as this does. Merciful Fate, Melissa. Now chances are you either love or deeply hate King Diamond's voice. It will most likely make or break this band for you instantaneously. His voice is obnoxiously high-pitched, even compared to Rob Halford of Judas Priest. I must admit I hated his voice at first. My introduction to this album was actually Metallica's cover called Merciful Fate, which is an epic medley that covers half of the songs on the album. This version was more palatable for me at the time, as I preferred James Hetfield's voice, but I've grown fond of the original version over time. This album mistakenly gets called black metal, but I don't really hear it. I think it's more their aesthetic than their sound. I mean, you wouldn't call Kiss black metal. To me, this album is more heavy metal meets occult rock, a pretty unique style, and a classic record. Vicious Rumors, Digital Dictator. Wow, how prophetic. We live in a society after all. This one's more underground, but I like to put in some lesser known bands into the mix. Digital Dictator is a mix of heavy metal, power metal, and prog metal. If you like my picks for Iron Maiden and Queensryche, you should probably check this one out as well. It also has a bit of a dystopian theme as well, and the album cover is pretty cool. Give this one a spin. Megadeth. Peace sells, but who's buying?
What do you mean I don't believe in God? Talk to him every day.
I'm sure this one is expected. This is a classic, and I felt that I had to include at least half of the big four. Megadeth is often thought of as the best of these bands, and with good reason. They have many fantastic albums, and this is no exception. The cover art and the title track are the epitome of 80s rebellion.
What do you mean I don't support your system? I go to court when I have to.
And the instrumentation is just chef's kiss. I would describe their sound as a mix of thrash metal, prog metal, and technical thrash. They are halfway between Metallica and Annihilator in this regard, and they have perfected a great sound. Enough said. Death, scream bloody gore. Now this very well might be the first death metal album. It's a safe bet that the band's name heavily contributed to the naming of the infamous metal genre. But unlike Candlemass with epic doom metal, this isn't as concrete, as there are other sources of the term death metal coined beforehand, such as a song by Possessed titled simply Death Metal. Possessed is certainly worthy of a mention, as they are sort of a proto-death metal band, their sound really riding the line between thrash metal and death metal. Scream Bloody Gore, though, I do believe, is where death metal truly emerged as its own identity. It is the iconic, old-school death metal sound. We're not talking about this, or this.
We're talking about this!
Given that the term death metal is abused mercilessly, this is death metal, pure and simple. Europe, the final countdown.
It's the final countdown.
Now for some pop metal. I'd like to take this opportunity to distinguish pop metal from glam metal, as the two are often conflated, sometimes lumped together under the very vague umbrella term hair metal, but I don't think that they are the same thing. I mean, would you call the final countdown a glam metal song? I wouldn't. It just doesn't have that same sleazy quality to it. So let me know what you think about this distinction, or any other of my hot takes. And to make matters more confusing, some bands seem to mix both styles, such as Bon Jovi or Def Leppard. But I think Europe is a good example of pure pop metal. Obviously, this album is heavily carried by their one-hit wonder, which we can all agree is a bop. But there are quite a few pretty good tracks, and I wanted this list to accurately reflect the 80s.
Danger on the track. Oh yeah.
Celtic Frost to Megatherion. First off, the cover art is both profound and deeply unsettling. This album was hugely influential to both black metal and death metal, but it itself isn't really either one of them. It has elements of them, but also has elements of thrash metal and doom metal. It's all over the map. It's its own thing. A Lovecraftian amalgamation of metal genres. It's really experimental too. Some consider it to be one of the first avant-garde metal albums, and it sounds just as out of place today as it did in the 80s. Nirvana, Bleach. Grunge may be associated with the 90s, but it got its start in the late 80s. At this time, metal was obsessed with becoming faster and faster, and overcomplicated, so some bands wanted to go back to the simpler, slower Black Sabbath sound. However, they also kept the punk influence that metal in the 80s had attained. And with the emerging, alternative rock scene, these elements coalesced into grunge. And I know that to many, grunge is not considered metal, but if you count pop metal and glam metal, but not this, then I don't know what to say. Bleach might not be the most metal thing ever, but I hear a bit of Sabbath and Motorhead in this. It's definitely heavier than their albums afterwards. My favorite tracks are Blue and Negative Creep. I also think that Nirvana represents a shift, a disillusionment with the denial of the 80s, which is giving way to the anger of the 90s. Holy Moses, the new machine of Liechtenstein. This is a killer, underrated Teutonic Thrash metal album. And no, that's not another subgenre per se, it just means German thrash, which has a slightly different sound than American thrash. Here we got some thrash, some prog, and some technical thrash. This is essentially female-fronted Megadeth with a German twist. As I said, I like to put some surprises on here, so I highly recommend Holy Moses. Bolt Thrower, Realm of Chaos. Here is the first Death Grind album, which is of course a mix of death metal and grindcore. There actually isn't a ton of straight-up death metal in the 80s. Most of it crosses over with other styles, such as thrash metal or grindcore, in some way. But regardless, the sheer amount of extreme metal music emerging at this time is astonishing. It denies so many basic assumptions that people had about music beforehand. And people like to debate whether American or Swedish death metal is better, but English death metal is often slept on. Don't overlook Bolt Thrower. Sanctuary, Refuge Denied. Rest in peace, Waraldane. He was the vocalist for both Sanctuary as well as Nevermore, and whereas in Nevermore he is known for his deeper, warbling voice,
That's my free will, once cast aside.
here in Sanctuary he displays his higher vocal range, which are much more analogous to Rob Halford or even King Diamond than they are to someone like Peter Steele. This album blends heavy metal with thrash metal, with the exception of their cover of Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit, where you can hear hints of what was to come with Nevermore. The rest of the record is basically 80s metal in a nutshell. Witchfinder General, Death Penalty. Now here's some straight up, traditional doom metal. Pure Sabbath worship. This one is really a holdover from the 70s, nothing too groundbreaking for the 80s. However, I wanted variety on this list, so I'll give it a mention. Probably the most straightforward band on the list. If you like Black Sabbath, you will most likely enjoy this too. There's some great guitar work here. And maybe a bit of proto-metal in this as well, but I assure you, you won't be hearing the term proto-metal again in this series. This is mostly Paranoid Part 2, with a bit of Zeppelin. Grinder, Dead End. This is a really underrated thrash metal album, with an unfortunate band name. This is a really underrated thrash metal album, which is also somewhat of an anomaly. The cover art makes it seem like it's a death metal album. This isn't far off from something Obituary would put out, but it's not. It's also a German band, but it sounds a lot less like Teutonic Thrash and more like their American counterparts. Also, it's fairly experimental, but I would hesitate to use the term prog metal. Finally, the strange cherry on top of the weird cake, it ends with a psychobilly track. But look past all these oddities, and this is some solid thrash metal, particularly on tracks such as Just Another Scar and Total Control. This is a thrash metal must. Crimson Glory, Transcendence. This music will take you to another dimension, blending power metal with prog metal. It covers all the topics that you would expect. Space, dragons, anti-communism. It was the 80s after all. The Cold War was definitely a strong factor behind a lot of the themes of nuclear destruction and authoritarian regimes that were present in much of 70s and 80s lyrics. No clearer is this present than on the track Red Sharks. This record is ear-piercing in the best way possible. It is the peak of the shrill, clean noise that describes the best of 80s metal. The 80s is where metal exploded. No more was it merely the venture of experimental hard rock bands of the 70s. It became both mainstream and extreme, really cementing metal music as its own genre, distinct from rock. 80s metal really has a fighting spirit to it. Whether it's Metallica ranting about tyranny, Queensryche telling us that we live in 1984, or Bathory proudly dying on the battlefield. The high-pitched vocals and thrashy guitars may have went out of fashion afterwards, but the 80s tends to evoke a lot of nostalgia for people. Next time, we shall leave denial behind and embrace the anger of the 90s. Our occulturation continues, as we ask ourselves, what's in a meme? Here are some honorable mentions.
Let it out.